He had everything most men spend a lifetime trying to build: a successful business, a respected name, and a loyal wife who had stood beside him long before anyone else believed in him. Her name was Angela, and for nearly 20 years, she had been more than a partner. She had been the quiet force behind every contract signed, every bill paid, every late night that turned into another step forward. Together, they built a life in a quiet American suburb where success looked stable and predictable from the outside. Their home was paid for, their daughters were in good schools, and his company, a mid-sized logistics firm, had finally started turning consistent profit after years of struggle. To friends and neighbors, Marcus Reed was the kind of man who figured things out, the kind of man who didn't fail. But success has a way of hiding the pressures that come with it. And inside that house, there was one voice that never stopped reminding him that what he had built still wasn't enough. His mother believed legacy wasn't measured in comfort or stability, but in control, in expansion, and most of all, in having a son who could carry the family name forward without limitation. And over time, that voice became louder than reason, louder than loyalty, louder than the woman who had helped him build everything he now stood to lose. And then, he made one decision. Not for love, not for money, but to please his mother. He brought another woman into his home, convinced himself it was temporary, necessary, even justified in a way he could explain later. And within months, everything started to fall apart. Money began to move in ways that didn't make sense. Accounts that were once stable started showing gaps, small at first, then impossible to ignore. Trust collapsed in silence, not through arguments or confrontation, but through absence, distance, and a growing realization that something fundamental had shifted. And the woman he thought would stay silent, the one he believed would accept, adjust, and endure as she always had, was already planning his downfall. By the time he realized what was happening, it was too late. The question is, how does a man who built everything with his own hands make the one decision that destroys it all? And how did the woman he underestimated see it coming long before he did? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. At first glance, it looked like a normal family decision, the kind people don't question too deeply because it sits inside tradition, expectation, and the quiet pressure of doing what is considered right. Marcus Reed had always seen himself as a provider first, a man who solved problems, carried responsibility, and made the kind of sacrifices that kept everything running. That identity had shaped every major decision in his life, from the risks he took to build his logistics company to the long hours that kept him away from home more often than he liked to admit. Angela understood that about him, which is why she never stood in his way when business demanded more of his time, more of his energy, more of their shared life. She had her own strength, but it wasn't loud or confrontational. It was measured, observant, and patient in a way that made people underestimate just how much she saw and understood. Then there was his mother, Evelyn Reed, a woman whose influence didn't rely on force but on persistence, a steady voice that framed her expectations as wisdom, her pressure as guidance, and her demands as necessary for the family's future. She believed Marcus had reached a point where stability was no longer enough, where expansion, control, and legacy mattered more than comfort, and over time, her perspective began to reshape his decisions in ways he didn't fully recognize. And then there was the second woman, introduced quietly, without confrontation, without explanation that made complete sense, an unfamiliar presence that entered their home under the justification of family expectations, but carried with it questions no one openly asked. But behind closed doors, something wasn't adding up, because the decision Marcus made wasn't just personal, it was structural. It shifted power, money, and trust in ways that couldn't stay hidden forever. Why would a man risk everything he built, not under pressure from failure, but at the peak of his stability? Was this really about family? Or was it about control, about influence that extended beyond what he was willing to admit? And how did the woman he underestimated, the one who had stayed silent for years, position herself in a way that would eventually outplay him completely? Because what looked like a decision made out of duty would soon reveal itself as the beginning of something far more calculated. And to understand how it all collapsed, we have to go back to the beginning. To understand how Marcus Reed reached that decision, you have to look at the years that came before it, long before the business stabilized, long before the house was paid off, back when everything he had was still uncertain and every step forward came with risk. Marcus wasn't handed anything. He built his logistics company from contracts most people overlooked, small deliveries that turned into larger deals, long days that turned into longer nights, and a constant pressure to prove that he belonged in rooms where no one initially took him seriously. What drove him wasn't just money, it was respect, the kind that couldn't be taken away, the kind that made people say his name with certainty. But even as he climbed, that pressure never left, because success, to him, wasn't a destination, it was something that had to be maintained, protected, expanded. And behind that drive was the expectation that he wouldn't just succeed for himself, but for the family name he carried, a name his mother had spent years reminding him he was responsible for elevating. Angela entered his life when there was no guarantee any of it would work, when the business was still fragile and the future was unclear. She didn't just support his vision, she became part of it, stepping into roles that didn't come with recognition but made everything else possible. She managed accounts when cash flow was tight, made sure bills were paid when income was inconsistent, and created stability in a life that could have easily fallen apart under pressure. She wasn't driven by emotion in the way people often expect. She was disciplined, focused, and deliberate, the kind of person who paid attention to details others ignored. Over time, her presence became woven into every part of what Marcus built, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that made everything function. She wasn't just his wife, she was part of the foundation. Evelyn Reed saw things differently, not in terms of what had been built, but in terms of what she believed was still missing. Her mindset was rooted in tradition, in the idea that a man's success wasn't complete until it secured the future of the family name in ways that extended beyond business. To her, legacy wasn't just about financial stability, it was about control, continuity, and ensuring that nothing was left to chance. She didn't dismiss Angela's role, but she didn't value it in the same way Marcus did, because in her eyes, contribution didn't equal authority and presence didn't equal permanence. Over time, her influence shaped conversations that Marcus didn't always question, suggestions that slowly turned into expectations, until the line between his decisions and her beliefs became harder to separate. And in that house, where everything appeared structured and stable from the outside, there was a truth that no one openly acknowledged, but everyone felt. In this house, decisions weren't always his to make. The shift didn't happen overnight, and that's what made it so easy to justify in the moment. It started with conversations that didn't feel like pressure at first, just repeated ideas, planted carefully over time. Evelyn Reed had a way of speaking that made her expectations sound reasonable, almost inevitable, as if she were simply pointing out what Marcus already knew but hadn't yet acted on. She would bring up the future in quiet moments, asking what would happen to everything he had built if something unexpected occurred, questioning whether one structure, one path, one household was enough to carry the weight of a growing legacy. She spoke about the family name as if it were fragile, as if it required more than what Angela and Marcus had already created to survive long-term. At first, Marcus pushed back gently, reminding her of what he and Angela had built together, the stability they had worked years to secure. But Evelyn didn't argue directly. She repeated, reframed, and returned to the same ideas in different ways, until resistance began to feel like avoidance rather than conviction. Over time, those conversations shifted from hypothetical to practical, from distant concerns to immediate considerations. Marcus began to see his decisions not just through the lens of his own judgment, but through the expectations that had been placed on him for years. The idea of expanding his household, of taking a second wife, stopped sounding extreme and started sounding like a calculated move, something that could protect the future rather than disrupt the present. He convinced himself it wasn't about replacing anything, not about diminishing Angela's role, but about adding another layer, another form of security that aligned with what his mother had always believed was necessary. And then came the moment where thought turned into action, where hesitation gave way to agreement, quiet, almost understated, but irreversible. Marcus Reed agreed to bring another woman into his life, into his home, into the structure he and Angela had spent years building. It wasn't loud, it wasn't announced with conflict or confrontation, It was decided in a way that made it feel controlled, manageable, as if everything would continue as it always had, just slightly adjusted. When Angela was told, there was no immediate reaction, no raised voice, no visible resistance that could be pointed to as conflict. She listened, processed, and responded in a way that left no clear opening for argument. She didn't argue. She didn't fight. And that's what made it dangerous. Because in that silence, Marcus saw acceptance, or at least something close enough to it that allowed him to move forward without fully questioning what it meant. But what he failed to understand was that Angela's calm wasn't agreement. It was observation, a shift from participation to evaluation. While he believed he was maintaining control of the situation, maintaining the balance he thought he could manage, Angela had already begun to see the structure differently. The decision that Marcus believed would expand his life had quietly changed the foundation beneath it. And from that moment forward, everything that followed would no longer be shaped by what he intended, but by what he failed to notice. At first, the changes were small enough to ignore, the kind of inconsistencies that could be explained away if no one looked too closely. But Angela had spent years managing the structure behind Marcus Reed's success, and she understood patterns, not just numbers, but behavior, timing, and intent. It started with money moving in ways that didn't match their usual flow, transfers that seemed routine on the surface but didn't align with any existing obligations or business operations she recognized. Marcus began making decisions without the same level of discussion they had always shared, approvals happening faster, explanations becoming shorter, and certain details left out entirely. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was different, and for someone like Angela, different was enough to start asking questions, even if those questions stayed unspoken. At the same time, there was a shift in the atmosphere of the home, a growing emotional distance that couldn't be traced to a single moment but was felt in the space between conversations, in the way routines changed without explanation, in the way Marcus carried himself as if he were managing something he hadn't fully revealed. Angela didn't confront him, not because she didn't notice, but because she understood that reacting too early would only limit what she could see. Instead, she adjusted quietly, stepping back from assumptions and focusing on information. She began reviewing financial records more closely, not just the surface-level reports, but the detailed transactions, the timelines, the connections between accounts that most people would overlook. She paid attention to patterns in spending, to the timing of transfers, to the subtle shifts that indicated something structured rather than accidental. She stopped reacting and started watching. What she found wasn't immediate, but it was consistent, small payments that led to larger ones, movements that pointed towards something being built outside the framework she and Marcus had established together. And then, piece by piece, the picture became clearer, a separate flow of money tied to accounts she hadn't been told about, accounts that connected directly to the second woman Marcus had brought into their lives. It wasn't just about presence anymore. It wasn't just about a decision influenced by family pressure. It was about resources, control, and intention being redirected in ways that affected everything they had built. And that's when she realized this wasn't just betrayal. The more Angela examined the records, the less room there was for interpretation, because what she was seeing wasn't accidental. It was structured, deliberate, and sustained over time. The accounts Marcus had kept separate weren't just hidden. They were active, consistently funded, and carefully maintained in a way that suggested long-term planning rather than a temporary adjustment. Payments that should have been reinvested into their business or secured for their household were being redirected, not in large, obvious amounts that would raise immediate concern, but in controlled transfers designed to avoid attention. And when she followed the pattern to its endpoint, when she connected every transaction, every withdrawal, every allocation, the conclusion was unavoidable. Marcus Reed hadn't just made a personal decision that affected their relationship. He had used the financial structure they built together, the stability she helped create, to support an entirely separate life. He used her money, their money, the foundation she helped secure, to fund the second life he believed he could maintain without consequence. That realization didn't lead to confrontation, it led to clarity. Angela understood that the situation was no longer about emotion or explanation. It was about position, control, and timing. She didn't rush, didn't react in a way that would alert Marcus to what she had discovered. Instead, She moved with the same discipline she had always applied to their business, reviewing ownership structures, reassessing account access, and identifying exactly where her leverage existed. Quietly, and without disruption, she began transferring control of assets into positions that protected her interests, separating what could be separated, securing what could be secured, and ensuring that the parts of the business tied directly to her involvement could no longer be accessed without her authorization. She restructured accounts, adjusted permissions, and removed the level of financial dependency Marcus had relied on without fully understanding it. Every step was measured, legal, and intentional, carried out in a way that maintained the appearance of normalcy while fundamentally changing the balance of power beneath the surface. He thought he was building a second life. She was closing the first one. The collapse didn't happen all at once, and that's what made it harder for Marcus Reed to recognize until it was already in motion. At first, it showed up in the business. Deals that once closed smoothly began to stall, payments that were expected on schedule started arriving late, and the financial cushion he had always relied on felt tighter than it should have been. He tried to adjust, to move things around the way he always had, but the access he assumed was still there no longer responded the same way. Accounts required approvals he didn't expect, transfers slowed, and decisions that once felt automatic now required a level of coordination he hadn't needed before. The structure he thought he controlled had changed, and he couldn't immediately see how or when it happened. At the same time, the second household he had created, the one he believed he could sustain without affecting anything else, began demanding more attention, more resources, more stability than he was now able to provide without strain. What once felt manageable started to feel heavy, then urgent, then unsustainable. As pressure increased, the gaps between what he thought he had and what was actually available became impossible to ignore. The business that once represented his strength now reflected his limitations, because the foundation supporting it had shifted without his full awareness. And while he was trying to stabilize what was slipping, Angela had already secured her position, her involvement in the business no longer something he could depend on without consideration, her financial independence no longer tied to his decisions. The balance of power had moved, quietly but completely. The second wife, once introduced as an addition to his life, became a liability he hadn't planned for, not because of who she was, but because of what maintaining that structure now required. And without the financial flexibility he once had, every decision carried weight he wasn't prepared to manage. In the end, what Marcus lost wasn't just money or stability, it was control, the very thing he believed he was protecting when he made the decision in the first place. The respect he had built, both in his business and in his home, no longer stood on the same ground, because the choices that led to his position couldn't be separated from the outcome he now faced. And Angela, the woman who had stood beside him through every uncertain step, didn't leave in anger or collapse under the weight of what happened. She walked away prepared, her position secured, her future no longer dependent on a structure that had already begun to fail. In the end, he didn't lose everything in a moment. He lost it the day he underestimated the person who helped him build it. Let me ask you something. Looking at everything Marcus Reed built, everything he risked, and everything he ultimately lost, would you have made the same decision in his position, or would you have handled the pressure differently when it first started showing up? Because the truth is, most decisions like this don't feel dangerous at the beginning. They feel justified, necessary, even logical depending on how they're presented and who is influencing them. Or would you have seen the warning signs earlier, not just in the financial shifts or the changes in behavior, but in the moments where control slowly started to move away without being noticed? And more importantly, would you have recognized the strength in someone like Angela before it was too late, before silence turned into strategy and observation turned into action? Because stories like this aren't just about one man's mistake, they're about how quickly things can change when the foundation is misunderstood. And if you think this story was intense, wait until you hear what happened in our next case, where another decision, just as calculated, led to an outcome no one involved was prepared for. Subscribe for more real stories where one decision changes everything.